Welcome back to the Vybrational Stage Podcast. Earlier this week, we explored the experience of being pulled in too many directions and discovered that overwhelm is often less about the number of responsibilities we carry and more about the emotional significance we attach to them. Today, I'd like to take that conversation deeper because there is a question hiding beneath overwhelm that many of us never stop long enough to ask. Who exactly is exhausted? At first, that might seem like an unusual question. The obvious answer is me. I'm exhausted. But when we begin looking carefully, something interesting starts emerging. Most of us are not operating from a single identity. We are operating from many. There's a professional self, the family self, the financial self, the social self, the future self, the fearful self, the ambitious self, the responsible self, the version of us that wants security, the version of us that wants freedom, the version of us that wants rest, the version of us that wants achievement. And while all of these identities have value, they often want different things. One part of you wants to slow down. Another part wants to accelerate. One part wants simplicity. Another part wants expansion. One part wants peace. Another part wants significance. And so the internal tension begins. Not because anything is wrong, but because multiple versions of ourselves are all attempting to drive at the same time. This is something I think many successful people experience, particularly leaders, particularly professionals, particularly those who have spent decades carrying responsibility, because responsibility has a way of becoming identity. At first, responsibility is something we do. Then responsibility becomes who we are, and eventually we can reach a point where we no longer know how to separate ourselves from the roles we perform. We stop being a person who leads, we become the leader. We stop being a person who provides, we become the provider. We stop being a person who solves problems, we become the problem solver. And slowly, almost invisibly, our humanity begins shrinking beneath our responsibilities. The irony is that many of these identities were originally created with good intentions. The achiever helped us build a career. The provider helped us support a family. The planner helped us navigate uncertainty. The protector helped us survive difficult seasons. None of these identities were wrong, but problems arise when we become unable to set them down. Because eventually life asks a difficult question. Who are you when you're not performing a role? For many people, that question feels uncomfortable. Perhaps even frightening, because so much of modern life rewards performance, rewards achievement, rewards productivity, rewards visible results. Very few people ask us who we are beneath all of that. And yet that deeper question may be one of the most important questions we can ever explore. Because the person we are trying to be can become exhausting. Not because the role is wrong, but because we were never meant to live exclusively inside a role. Think about how much energy it takes to constantly maintain an image, to constantly meet expectations, to constantly satisfy responsibilities, to constantly manage outcomes, to constantly hold everything together. At some point, the nervous system begins asking for relief. At some point, the heart begins asking for space. At some point, life begins whispering, you do not have to carry everything. You do not have to be everything. You do not have to solve everything. And perhaps that's where today's conversation becomes deeply personal. Because being pulled in too many directions is often a symptom. The deeper issue is that too many identities are making demands on our attention. The achiever wants one thing. The caretaker wants another. The dreamer wants another. The fearful self wants another. And because we rarely stop to notice this internal competition, we assume that tension is coming from the outside world. But often the tension is being generated internally. This realization can be profoundly empowering because if overwhelm is entirely external, we are at the mercy of circumstances. But if overwhelm is partially being created by internal fragmentation, then something becomes possible. Awareness, choice, self-leadership, the ability to consciously decide what deserves our attention and what does not. That doesn't mean responsibilities disappear. It doesn't mean life suddenly becomes easy. It doesn't mean we stop caring. It means we stop unconsciously giving every voice equal authority. Because not every thought deserves obedience. Not every fear deserves a response. Not every expectation deserves fulfillment. Not every opportunity deserves pursuit. And not every version of ourselves deserves control of the steering wheel. There is something deeper beneath all of them. A quieter presence, a deeper awareness, a part of you that existed before the titles, before the expectations, before the pressure, before the achievement, before the failures, before all the stories. That deeper awareness does not need to prove itself. It doesn't need validation. It doesn't need protection. It does not need constant activity. It simply is. And perhaps that is why so many people feel drawn towards simplicity later in life. Not because they've lost ambition, not because they have become passive, but because they begin recognizing the cost of carrying unnecessary complexity. They begin realizing that more isn't always better, that bigger isn't always better, that busier isn't always better, that sometimes the greatest form of wisdom is subtraction, removing what no longer serves, reducing what no longer matters, simplifying what has become unnecessarily complicated. Which brings us to today's invitation. Not to solve everything, not to fix everything, not to figure out your entire future, but simply to notice. Notice the identities demanding your attention. Notice the expectations you are carrying. Notice the roles you're performing. Notice the pressure you are placing upon yourself. And then gently ask, what truly belongs to me right now? Not next year, not next month, not tomorrow, right now. Because clarity rarely arrives through complexity. Clarity arrives through reduction, through simplification, through the willingness to let go of what is unnecessary. And that brings us to today's VybeShift Blog experience. While the Vybrational Stage Podcast explores the deeper meaning behind this week's core problem, the VybeShift Blog is where we begin transforming awareness into action. Monday's blog invited you to identify the competing directions pulling at your attention. Today's installment introduces the second step in the framework, reducing unnecessary variables. Not every demand deserves equal attention. Not every responsibility deserves equal emotional weight. And by learning how to identify what is truly yours to carry, you begin creating space for clarity to emerge. Then on Friday, everything comes together. The complete roadmap will be revealed, providing a practical self-empowerment framework for navigating the experience of being pulled in too many directions at once. That framework will also serve as the foundation for the upcoming VSP4 immersive experience. You can continue the journey by following the link in the show notes or reach out directly at vybeshiftconnect@gmail.com, and that also is in the show notes. Until next time, remember this: The goal is not to become a better performer. The goal is to become more fully yourself. And sometimes the path back to yourself begins by realizing that the person you have been trying so hard to be is no longer the person you need to become.